Just kidding. I don't know if everybody knows this, but when pronouncing Bible names, there's a very important little trick that if you master, you'll never go wrong again. You got those difficult Bible names and Bible places, and the trick is have unwavering confidence. Pretend like whatever you said is absolutely right, and then when someone says, "I always thought it was this," you say, "Oh yeah, well I was reading it out of the original languages." It's a little. That's my trick. It'll work for you too, though. Well, in any event, we're so glad you're here. I can't express how much I've been pleasantly surprised to enjoy Esther. When we started Ruth and then when we started Esther, I thought, the only thing I've ever seen is maybe a single session, maybe a couple, 3 sessions. So to dive in across now 9 sessions in Esther, it's really been a rewarding study for me, and I hope it has for you as well. And as we noted in our previous discussion, whoop, that's no good. Get that. As we noted in our previous discussion, this story is perfectly crafted, and it came with our foreshadowing. It came with the tragic fall of Haman. It came with the Lord's deliverance and putting Esther in the right place at the right time. We had the pinnacle of the action last week in that, but there's just something about us that we love to see the bad guy get what's coming to them. And I think we can almost look at almost any movie, and whether or not it satisfies that desire, as you see the bad guy fall off the building or get hauled off to jail, or if it's just a romantic comedy, get pizza sauce or spaghetti sauce spilled all over him. Whatever it is, we've got a kind of a commensurate level of punishment or pain or humiliation that we want to see the bad guys. We want to see people get what's coming to us. And this book, not every book in the Bible gives us that satisfaction in such a great dramatic way. This book really does. So we're going to take advantage of and hopefully enjoy this resolution of all of the action, right? Now that Haman is out of the picture, really the deal's been dealt with, but we find out that there's a lot more going on. We might say, oh, and Haman died, and they lived happily ever after, right? Do you ever get to the end of a movie or a book and say, wait a minute, they never talked about that, or they introduced this character, but they never brought it back around again? You see those little holes in storytelling or plot lines? Well, the Bible doesn't do that to us. In fact, we see that as we continue, we get a full 3-chapter, one of them, granted, is really tiny. 10 is only a couple verses long. But we get 3 whole chapters just to dedicate to tying up all the loose ends and letting us know how this action resolves. And that's important because, again, if as many people, as liberals or critics of the Bible will allegate that this book in particular is just a fairy tale or a poetic story of some kind, this resolution would be somewhat unnecessary, right? The drama with Haman is over, and yet what does it do? It goes to great lengths to talk about how the Jews were preserved, and it's not in any fairy tale fashion. What we're going to see is that there's still quite a bit of violence and bloodshed yet to occur, and there's quite a bit of tension. So while we might have been tempted to kind of, wash our hands and say that was a good study and a lot of fun and God really provided, let's go home, there's actually so much going on yet to discover. So last study, we got to look at how Haman had risen to the height of his power. He'd then been humiliated by God, really, right? Because he'd gone in to ask for the life of Mordecai, the only thing that was taking joy from his life of self-indulgence and pride and arrogance. And instead, God had kept the king up all night thinking about how he was going to reward Mordecai and made Haman the one who would deliver that reward to Mordecai. But that humiliation went on and got far worse when Mordecai showed up at the second banquet of Esther that Esther had strategically thrown and wound up in a heap of trouble when finally Esther revealed her request to save her people. The king said, "Who would do this?" And she said, "It is Haman." And the king rightfully took some big breaths and went outside to figure out what he was going to do. In the meantime, Haman fell all over the queen. And the original language is very graphic. We didn't talk about it, but the king made some assumptions about Haman's intentions. He said, would he even do that? Try to do that to the queen? That rather adult, aggressive, and violent act? Like, couldn't imagine. So here's Haman crying and begging and pleading for his life, and the king is so blown away by the hypocrisy and by the deceptiveness of Haman that when he sees her having tripped and fallen and crying all over the queen, he suspects him of even more evil. So suffice to say, it was a bad day. And it ended with Haman hanging on the very post that he had erected to humiliate the corpse of Mordecai. And that irony showed us a lot. And now we see that Esther receives the house of Haman. Now this might sound to us a little bit unfair, right? And in our sense of justice and how we would do things, if someone was executed, maybe, which again is a rarity these days, but if someone were executed for some heinous act or action, then all of their goods or assets would go where? Well, to their next of kin or whoever it had been willed to, right? That's how we think of inheritance. But the interesting thing is that we find in Persian law, particularly in many ancient laws, this is the case. This is from the Zondervan Illustrated Bible Backgrounds Commentary, Volume 3. It says, when someone betrayed the king, their property was forfeited. Herodotus, who's a famous Greek historian, reports that the estate of the traitor named Oretus became the property of the state. Josephus writes that Cyrus decreed that anyone who did not obey his laws concerning the Jews would be crucified and their estates confiscated by the Persian government. Haman's estate had become Xerxes, and he could do with it as he pleased. He chose to give it to Esther, either in compensation for her grief or as an expression of his royal favor. So we see, again, another thing that might be mildly confusing to us, but we understand the history of the age, that we see that this all fits with what we know. Again, such an important point, because the Bible comes under such flippant and constant attack. And yet what we see is that whenever the Bible preserves a custom, we see that idea represented elsewhere or mirrored elsewhere in other writings. We constantly see that confirmation. So even if we don't have specific and direct archaeological evidence of a Queen Esther or a Mordecai who came to this place, although there is another very important man named Mordecai who is involved in Persian government. Some wonder if they might be the same fellow, but it's difficult or impossible for us to say. The point is that the Bible shows itself to be accurate in so many details. So many details that would have surely been lost or a mystery to anyone who is not writing at that time. So many times the allegation is that the authors of the Bible were writing hundreds of years later. And the reality is we forget how difficult it would be to come across that information. It's difficult enough for us with this massive abilities of the internet and libraries and years of scholarship. It's difficult for us to find out what people were doing in Persia. How much less so folks who would probably not travel within 100 miles of their home in a lifetime and certainly didn't have access to records. And oh, by the way, that's not what most historical records kept track of. It's us that's interested in what kind of tea they drank or whether they drank wine or whiskey. But back then, that was just the boring stuff. And the really exciting stuff was who killed who and who took over whose kingdom, right? So a lot of that stuff's not even preserved for us in common things. We have to look at various other types of documents to get these confirmations. And when we see that, we need to celebrate that, or at least make that known, that truly anyone looking at the archaeology, the historical records, has to admit that the Bible is at least shockingly reliable. And of course, we believe absolutely accurate as it was given to us from the very mouth of God. Nevertheless, Esther now receives the house of Haman. So we see that this wasn't some sort of dishonest move. This would be something that would be exactly what we expected, particularly for a traitorous household. And that might sound extreme to us. We'd say, well, just because Haman was a traitor doesn't mean everybody else was. But you remember how Haman is dealt with every situation so far. What does he do? He goes back to his household. He consults with his advisors and his family, right? So the idea is that if one person or the leader of that household is treacherous or a traitor, then probably the whole household has traitorous possibilities or intent. Which again sounds shocking to us and might even be scandalous to our sense of justice. But that wasn't a feature of the ancient world. If somebody was after your crown or wished you ill as a leader, then you would simply eliminate them. There was no other logical choice. Remember, these people weren't under the Western ideals of justice and equality, nor were they under the biblical ideals of a righteous God who'd revealed himself and who is ultimately, or to whom all people are ultimately responsible. So it shouldn't surprise us at some of these brutal customs. So Esther gets everything, and Mordecai gets Haman's job. So Haman's kind of role as the second in command, or so it would seem, at least a very high-ranking official, was now given to Mordecai. Now Mordecai owns and has absolutely everything that Haman had ever had. This shows us a complete reversal of fortunes. You know, we don't always get to see this in life, right? Sometimes the bad guys win, at least as near as we can tell. Sometimes they get away with it. I was talking to a friend of mine at a DM2 conference many years ago, and I asked him how many murders in the Denver area were basically gotten away with. How many people got away with murder? It was an alarming number. It was an unsettling number, right? If you watch all the television shows, if you like those sorts of television shows, they almost always catch the guy, or if he gets away, he only just gets away, right? But actually, there's quite a few murders, tragically, even in a rather peaceful part of the world, a rather peaceful time in history, that go on. However, when we see things working out, we might say, as they should, wherein the bad guys get the just desserts of it, we should really take note and recognize that resonates within us for a reason. It resonates within us. That makes us feel excited. It makes us feel satisfied because you're created in the image of God. You are created, and this is believers and unbelievers, with a natural gearing towards wanting to see the bad guys lose and see the good guys win. You want to see the aggressors, the thieves, the murderers, the whatever they are, the bloodthirsty pirates lose, and you want to see the people, the guys in white hats, basically come out on top. And this complete reversal of fortune shows us what God has built into us from the very beginning. Psalm 37, 34 through 36 says, "Wait on the Lord, and he will keep his way, and he shall exalt you to inherit the land. When the wicked are cut off, you shall see it. I have seen the wicked in great power, and spreading himself like a native green tree, yet he passed away, and behold, he was no more. Indeed, I sought him, but he could not be found." Again, we don't always get to see these things come to such a satisfying end, but when we do, we celebrate it, and we should. There won't always be justice and righteousness in this world. Sin has the presence of sin and the influence of Satan, and this world system will always ensure that until the Lord's return. Nevertheless, on such times as the Lord allows us to see true justice take place, it behooves us to recognize it, to make note of it, to celebrate it, right? So hopefully when we see injustice taking place, we take note of it. And when we see something happen that is just and right, when we see the punishment of the wicked or whatever it is, it should give us a sense of that God's character is being reflected in our society. So, rare or common, it is certainly of the Lord when justice is served. So now we get to the real problems in verse 3 through 6. It says, "Then Queen Esther chapter 8. Now Esther spoke again to the king, fell down at his feet, and implored him with tears to counteract the evil of Haman the Agagite and the scheme which he had devised against the Jews. And the king held out the golden scepter towards Esther. So Esther arose and stood before the king and said, 'If it pleases the king, and if I have found favor in your sight, and things seem right to the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes. Let it be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, which he wrote to annihilate the Jews who are in all the king's provinces. For how can I endure to see the evil that will come to my people? Or how can I endure to see my destruction, or the destruction of my countrymen? So, it would be easy, I think, to get excited about the small victory. Haman had been defeated, Haman had been destroyed, and forget all about the big problem, right? We can get caught in a minor victory that feels great, and undoubtedly to Esther, this had to feel like a great victory. She just became very wealthy, was able to reward her father figure by putting him in that place over all that wealth that was Haman's. She was able to celebrate over that victory, knowing that her father or stepfather, if we were to call it that, Mordecai, adoptive father, I guess, Mordecai, was now in a better job than he could have ever dreamed to achieve on his own. She could celebrate the fact that she had now strengthened her relationship with the king, and he had even made some sort of concession to her, either because of as the little text from the resource pointed out, either because he had some pity on her or wanted to compensate her for her grief, but also very likely because he recognized that it was him personally that caused this problem. Now, granted, not him directly. Haman was the one who did it, but he was the one who signed off on it. It was all done in the king's name. And so would make sense for her to do that. And legend, at least, suggests that she used much of the wealth, and Mordecai used much of the wealth, to help prepare and protect the Jews for what was about to come. But Esther, we see, doesn't get distracted. I mean, this is a huge victory. She had unseated one of the most powerful men in the kingdom because she was so wise and so cunning in this event. But she doesn't get distracted. She keeps her eye on the main thing. And I want to tell just a little story. This isn't what the text is teaching. This is just a side trail for us to walk down. You see, when we're dealing with the world, we might sometimes get distracted by some sort of small victory. We might convert someone to thinking the way that we think, or maybe even just winning an argument about whatever, social issue, abortion, homosexuality, gay marriage. We might be able to win them to our side on those issues. And that might be a good thing. I mean, certainly as if they're starting to think more biblically, it's always a good thing. That's not the point. You're not here to argue them out of their bad habits, and you're certainly not here to argue them into your political viewpoints. The big victory, the big problem in their life is still sin. The big need in their life is still the Lord Jesus Christ. So let's, like Esther, never be distracted from the main point. She didn't lose her head. She didn't lose sight of where the real problem was. The real problem wasn't Haman. The real problem was the potential satanic elimination of the Jewish people. So notice the change in behavior. Before, she was controlled. She was calculating. She was taking very careful steps to make sure that whatever she did had the best possible impact to get that response that she needed to get out of Ahasuerus or out of the king. But now she, either in wisdom or because the threat is coming closer with each passing day, she becomes bold, open, and emotionally begs. I want you to notice a subtle thing. We oftentimes read these verses as if, like in a modern, maybe American novel, we think they all come immediately after another, but it seems that some time was passing in the course of this. I mean, the king didn't just say that afternoon, Mordecai wasn't even in the room, right? And say, all right, this is what's going to happen. You're going to get that and you're going to get that. Undoubtedly, that happened after days of deliberation. Even the execution of Haman probably happened that day, but certainly took up more time than we might think. It's not as if they're still sitting in the drawing room, is my point. So some time has passed. And then it'd be easy to miss this one simple statement that the king extended his scepter to her. You see, Esther risked the same death that she would have risked in her first foray into the king's court. And interestingly, for whatever reason now, she seems to have gone in incredibly boldly, very emotionally, and yet, received again this approval from the king. In a sense, we'd say, he saved her life twice on this account, or at least when he didn't have to. Notice her request and the nature of her request. First of all, notice how polite and humble it is. If it pleases the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and if this thing seems right to the king, and if I am pleasing in his eyes. Listen to that. There's a lot of humility in those words, isn't it? And again, I just want to point this out because it's so important. Oftentimes, we're not able to get what is right or what is best, whether we're the employee looking up to an authority figure of some kind, because we're not willing to humble ourselves before them and recognize the difference in our positions, right? I don't mean to say this as some sort of trick, and it would never be this way, but I have been spared. It's just the sounds, or it's just the heater. It does that. It's funny. But I have been spared probably not less than 3 speeding tickets in my life, just because I'm always very, very polite. Some people, specifically females, maybe can get out of a speeding ticket by batting eyes and whatever, the feminine charms thing. I got none of that. And yet I've still been released from my just punishment and speeding tickets very occasionally. I think because the police officer has been so off-put, or not so off-put, so caught off guard by the fact that I just respect their authority and thank them for doing their job and tell them and let them know I'm not going to give them a hard time for doing what they're supposed to do to keep us all safe. And by the way, it was my fault for going too fast. In other words, if you're going to make a successful request, you have to be willing to sacrifice and become or be humble before another person after a right manner. Because it shows that Esther cares more about her request than she does about her own pride. And people respond to that. Rightly so. So if this sounds overly groveling to you, if this sounds too humiliating, I think that we can all, especially in the American context, grow in wisdom and understanding what it means to humble ourselves before another, particularly before God, for another though, when we have something larger than ourselves to accomplish, as Queen Esther did here. So she's so polite. She keeps saying, if it pleases you, if it seems right in your sight, if I am pleasing to you, if I am pleasing in your eyes. In other words, she's saying, I'm out for your best good, and I want to be positively subservient to you. So here we have Warren Wiersbe on this idea. He says, the problem Esther and Mordecai faced was that the king, simply by executive fiat, couldn't cancel the first edicts, since the laws of the Medes and the Persians were unalterable. In modern democratic nations, legislatures can reverse decisions and revoke laws. And the Supreme Court of the land can even declare laws unconstitutional, but not so in the ancient despotic Persian Empire. The voice of the king was the law of the land, and the king could do no wrong. The king couldn't legally revoke his edict, but he could issue a new decree that would favor the Jews. The new decree would let everyone in the empire know that the king wanted his people to have a different attitude towards the Jews and look favorably upon them. The citizens didn't have to hire a lawyer to explain the new edict to them. You can be sure they got the message. Don't attack the Jews on March 7th. So, first of all, she's very polite. She recognizes the situation, that she couldn't of her own authority do anything, and she needed his approval, support, and his working in this as the king. And then she says, let it be written to revoke the letters revised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, which he wrote to annihilate the Jews who are in the king's province. To quote the great theologian Steve Martin in the fantastic theological work, Trains, Planes, and Automobiles. He said, whenever you're talking to someone or telling a story, have a point. It makes it so much more enjoyable for the listener. And that's what Esther does well here. She doesn't beat around the bush and waste his time. She lets him know that she's humble before him, that she understands his position and hers, and that she understands that she's asking him to go out of his way for her. But then she gets right to the point and asks for exactly what she wants. That's a really important part that's missing from most requests, right? Is that direct, this is precisely what I want, this is what I think needs to happen. And then she adds the personal emotional plea to make sure that the importance of this is hammered home. She says, for how can I endure to see the evil that will come upon my people? Or how can I endure to see the destruction of my countrymen? So here she, in a beautiful Hebrew poetry pattern, says, how can I live? How can I endure? How can I hope to be happy in spite, or if this happens to my people? So this is really, again, another great bit of wisdom from the book of Esther on how to get things done, or how to get your requests granted. And this is not to be manipulative. This is just to point out the reality. If you're polite and humble before the person from whom you need a favor, you want something, you're direct and simple in your request. You're not trying to hide facts or bait or deceive them in any way. And finally, you let forth after those things your personal and emotional appeal. You can very often see that you get a better response, or at least have a chance at a better response. All right, and the king, of course, approves. It says, then the king Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and Mordecai the Jew, indeed, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows because he has tried to lay his hand on the Jews. You yourselves write a decree concerning the Jews as you please in the king's name, and seal it with the king's signet ring. For whatever is written in the king's name and sealed in the king's signet ring, one cannot revoke. I kind of love this because it shows that the king really didn't learn his lesson at all. Like, how did he get in all this trouble? By giving someone else a signet ring and saying, hey, you just take care of it, it'll be fine, I'm sure. What does he do? You just take care of it, it'll be fine, I'm sure. It's weird. Anyway, so the king's scribes were called at that time, the 3rd month, which is the month of Sivan, or in the 23rd day, and it was written according to all that Mordecai commanded to the Jews, the satraps, the governors, and the princes in the province from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces in all, to every province in its own script, to every people in their own language, and to the Jews in their own script and language. And he wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus, sealed it with the king's signet ring, and sent letters by the couriers on horseback, riding on royal horses, bred from swift steeds. So, first of all, we need to note that the king again approves Esther's request. How the Lord was at work in this situation is almost uncanny. How many things did he move? How many things did he change to grant this one request and guard and protect his people, the Jews, both within and without of the land, the faithful Jews and the unfaithful alike? He was looking after his people, the apple of his eye. He delegates the responsibility to them personally. I do think it's a little bit funny because it shows he didn't learn his lesson, but at the same time, it's, you're the king. You got to delegate. So who does he delegate this to? By God's grace, the exact people who are most qualified and most interested in seeing it done properly and seeing it done well. And there is a good leadership example in that. If you are a leader, then you're going to have to delegate responsibility, and you need to make sure you're delegating to the right people. He learned the wrong way with Haman, and hopefully now is seeing a better result. Now that he's given the solution to this problem to his best and brightest, his queen and Mordecai, undoubtedly. Everything was entirely official. We see the king's scribes. Now, again, another thing we will take for granted in our world today is literacy, access to writing, the education needed to write books and all these things. And as we notice, in a massive empire like this, you wouldn't just have one scribe, because one guy wouldn't know how to speak all those languages and write proficiently in all those languages. So this would be quite a group of people who would come in and would be learned to write and make the official edicts and decrees in a multilingual empire. This is a big deal. Again, don't just think about the king going, scribes, and a bunch of little nerds coming in like, we've come here to nerd for you. That's not how this works. This would have been quite an affair over some amount of time. wherein the scribes would be gathered together and they'd all be talking over the specific language. And it's very important that we understand that just as today and then, official governmental communiques had to be very careful and deliberate in how they're communicated. And so they needed these learned people whom the Lord put at the king rather, put at their disposal in order to see this thing outright. We notice that the message was nationwide. They could have limited it to just the places where they knew the Jews were and were living, but they didn't do that. It went everywhere from one end of the kingdom to the other to make sure that everyone knew that there was a game change. And it was written in the name of the king. It came with the king's seal. That made it unquestionable, and sealed with his signet ring. That made it personal. He moved through the king's own high-speed internet, or the royal horses. So they had really fancy, fast horses, which meant that the message would go quickly, but also that it would certify it in its authenticity. Here's Warren Wiersbe again. According to 8:9, the new edict was written on the 23rd day of the third month, which on our calendar would be June 25th, 474 BC. Remember, the Jewish calendar begins with the month of April. The first decree was issued on April 17th. Thus, about 70 days had passed since Haman had declared war on the Jews. D-Day for the Jews was March 7th. Therefore, the people had about 8 months to get ready. We see that, again, the king, for a number of reasons, was not able to simply rescind the order. That's what we'd expect, right? Sorry, guys, canceled. We goofed up. It was a mistake. Pull it back. But there were a handful of reasons. First of all, being that the nature of the government was that the king was divine or very close to divine, and therefore, if he were to change his mind or change a decree, that would show that he'd made a mistake, and that was not acceptable. Couldn't keep up appearances, right? And it shows us how incredibly important it is that we do not worship our government as gods, any government as God or from the gods. And it's why every ancient despot and demagogue wanted to be recognized as a god or descended from the gods, because they wanted to take religious authority and their personal authority and essentially fulfill all the desires of Satan and the Antichrist, all in their own little sad, self-absorbed world. But there's a great freedom in living in a country wherein you can challenge and question, because you know that your governors are fallible and your presidents are fallible and your rulers are fallible, and thus might need to change their mind. They might make a mistake, and hopefully there's things in place to fix or correct those mistakes. And hopefully, as good citizens, we can even be patient with whoever rulers and authorities are in place and say, you might have made a mistake on this one, and let's work together to correct this, right? It's a really important thing, because I could see in a certain segment of our culture, on every side, right and left, a certain amount of nearly religious fervor. People who are worshiping government or government institutions. On one side, again, this isn't a right-left thing. This is a nature of the temperature of political discourse in America, where people are willing to say that our side never makes mistakes, or our government should always be absolutely and unquestioningly obeyed. No, our government is fallible, made by sinful and made up of sinful men and women, and thus needs to be questioned and held to account as much as we can. And as long as we have the ability to do that, we must celebrate it. So it's an important side note, if you like, on why this was such a destructive thing. But the other reason why is that we'll look at that other reason why this is an important solution. So the content of the solution here is that the Jews could, let's read it first. It says that by these letters the king permitted the Jews who were in every city to gather together and protect their lives, to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the forces of any people or providence that would assault them, both little children and women, and to plunder their possessions on one day in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. A copy of the document was to be issued as a decree in every province and published for all people, people so that all the Jews would be ready on that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. The couriers who rode on the royal horses went out, hastened and pressed on by the king's command, and the decree was issued in Shushan in the citadel. So, did you notice that's pretty harsh? First of all, the Jews could gather together. This probably would have been a good idea. As everybody in town, or a certain number of people in town, even just the ne'er-do-wells were going to make an open attack. So the first thing they were allowed to do is congregate in one place and consolidate their kind of defensive structure. The next thing they were allowed to do is defend themselves. They were given legal permission to, and this meant to acquire arms and to prepare to defend themselves so that when the time came they could. So not a commercial for the Second Amendment, but all right, they're allowed to defend themselves, and that becomes a good thing in this situation. And then the part that we might find a little bit upsetting is that they take extreme vengeance against their attackers. They're told that they have the right to assault them and their women and children and plunder their possessions. Ooh, it's a little dark, isn't it? Like, go kill all the guys that are coming after you and then go kill all their families and then go take all their stuff. I mean, goodness. It's a little less than attractive, isn't it? We'll look at it in a minute. Finally, they may take this is going to seem like a strange way to resolve the conflict, right? We would say in today's time, you know what we need to do? You disperse the National Guard. You make sure you got enough soldiers everywhere so that you can stop the things from happening and keep the two sides apart, and then you're going to make it's going to be okay. But that's modern world thinking. They would not have had that kind of a military force. They wouldn't have had that kind of ability to coordinate such a thing. And essentially what the last decree had done is said to the worst scumbags in the land, this is your chance to get a get-out-of-jail-free card to take some of the most industrious, wise, and wealthy people and destroy them without mercy, killing even their families and taking all their stuff. And when those people, those baddies, got that news, what do you think they did? They got excited. They got ready. They were already undoubtedly planning for this merciless looting of the Jewish communities around the world. And so it would be very easy for them, if they heard the call back, like, hey, never mind, to go, I didn't hear that. Anti-Semitism will always exist and undoubtedly still existed, particularly amongst the dregs of this society. So it'd be very easy for them, having gotten this idea into their head and having been orchestrated around this special day, it'd been very difficult to imagine how you could assure that it wouldn't happen anyway. And then how could you rightfully prosecute them knowing that they had an official document saying that they were allowed to do it, right? So it caused all kinds of problems. And we see that this is actually a very wise command by ancient standards. So, first of all, the Bible records, and this is important because this is going to sound like a moral. This is one of those passages that people look to and say, look at that. He said that they could murder all the kids and murder all the women and take all the stuff. Is that moral? Well, hold on a second. The Bible records what truly happened. It doesn't necessarily approve of all those actions which are recorded. This is very, very important because sometimes absolutely filthy, horrible, awful things happen in this world because sinful men perpetrate them. And the Bible accurately records some of the times when those things happen. Just because the Bible records something doesn't mean it approves it. This is a very important issue that comes up in our understanding of the Bible. When God designed marriage, he designed it to be one man and one woman for a lifetime. And then we say, well, Abraham took, and then so-and-so took more wives, and then David, and then Solomon, so it must be okay. No. Now, God in his grace didn't withdraw his hand from them, but it never approved those wicked, evil, polygamous practices. The Bible records things because they happened. It doesn't approve everything that it records. So this is a command of a pagan king, a king of Persia. So that doesn't necessarily mean that, in fact, it necessarily does not mean that God approves of that practice. It's very important because people will stumble upon these things, the one time they read the Bible and say, the Bible, God kills people. Yes, God is a major cause of death to bring the grace and salvation. And furthermore, as we understand, the nature of God and who he is and what he is means that he alone has the right to bring justice, judgment, and death. It's not right for us to kill like that, but it's God's right to tell when a group's time is up or whatever. All right, so next, remember the original command? Just imagine for a moment the government came out with a new COVID restriction, and it told you that you were allowed, free of all possible penalty, to murder one of your neighbors, or maybe a group, however that group was defined. You're allowed to go get together with your friends, murder them all, and take all of their stuff. Think about this in very real terms. You get this in the little green sheet from the government telling you that day's coming on March 22nd. Think about it. What would you do? What would you do if you found out that you could go plunder everything in one of your neighbor's houses? I know most of us well enough to know what you would do. Probably one of two things. Hopefully we'd stand up to help and defend those people because that sounded like such an unjust thing, right? At the very least, most decent people would stay home and not participate. Why are we pointing this out? This command that Haman made appealed and only to the very dregs of society, to the scum of the earth, to the satanically controlled, to the darkest, dankest depths of all human sadness and disgust and sin. This original command or law or whatever it was, edict, really roused the opportunity for a great evil to take place. The need for an extreme counter command had to be there. There had to be deterrent, as we've seen. So this might seem harsh by our standards, but it's also pretty appropriate, given the type of people that had been mobilized against the Jews with all of their rage. So hopefully some of those perspectives help us, one, understand what's going on and the drama here. Again, it's so easy to get caught in the humor of and the irony of the account of Haman and forget that there was a genocide very legitimately on the table here. It could have ended the Jewish people if that were possible. J. Vernon McGee has a wonderful quote. He says, "The Jew has attended the funeral of every one of those nations that tried to exterminate him." And so this story will go. I want to take a note as we look at this last section of this chapter, 15 through 17. It says, "So Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal apparel of blue and white, with a great crown of gold and a garment of fine linen and purple, in the city of Shushan, rejoiced and was glad. The Jews had light and gladness, joy and honor, and in every province and city where the king's command and decree came. The Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a holiday. Then many of the people of the land became Jews, because of the fear of the Jews fell upon them." You know, one of the things details that we might miss in this is how Mordecai is clothed. We're not given much information about his clothing early on, although it must have been unremarkable because we're not given it. But then we see Mordecai changing into sackcloth to mourn Haman's foul decree. When he hears about it, what does he do? He immediately changes out of whatever clothes he was ordinarily wearing and starts wearing the rough, uncomfortable garb of mourning, of public display of a deep internal sense of being troubled, right? And we see that when that was going on, Esther saw him in the gate and tried to clothe him, right? The first thing that he thought is, oh no, his clothes fell off. Go get him some more. But that's not what had happened, right? So she goes and, hey, cover that up. But he doesn't. He continues to wear these clothes of mourning and refuses the opportunity to be dressed in anything else. Even though that limits him in his professional capacity, he is so disturbed and wanting to make a public statement about what has disturbed him so thoroughly. He was dressed with the king's robe. Now, you think about this, again, presuming, and this is an assumption here, but presuming that he continues on in the robe, he was in the king's robe over his clothes of mourning. He was placed in the king's robe wrapped around him, and he rode around on the king's horse. And then finally then he goes and returns to the gate, again, potentially to mourn and we might say publicly protest again. And now he wears the beautiful royal apparel that is his own. I can't say that there's any sort of astounding lesson to this, but if there was, I think it's that Mordecai, because of his continued character, upstanding character and willingness to do what is right, desire to do what is right, brought him from a normal situation into a place of great mourning, into the places of highest honor in the land. And it's a beautiful moment when that happens indeed. And there was much rejoicing. We find that the city rejoiced. Again, Persia was a metropolitan nation, and while anti-Semitism and anti-Semites were certainly active, that the greater bulk of Persians just thought, hey, we're all part of this huge empire together. Why would we want to go kill all of just this one people group? And so the city rejoiced for the fact that they were going to get to miss out on a war, right? This was going to be disruptive and distracting and painful and dangerous in almost every city, right? Even if there was a clash between two different factions of extremists in our land, what would be most disturbing about it would be the damage that would be wreaked on everybody else who wanted no piece of it, no part of it. So of course the city's going to rejoice. One, a great injustice is being not done, or they're being saved from a great injustice. And two, they're being saved from their entire cities, all their cities being ravaged by this conflict, or at least possibly. And of course, the Jews rejoiced, the Jewish people rejoiced with joy and gladness and had a feast and a holiday. So the Jews had a light and gladness, joy and honor. This is a beautiful celebration for the Jewish people. But it's kind of funny because, as we're going to see, the story is not over. All they won the right to do was to fight back. The trial was still ahead. It was still going to be messy. It was still going to be difficult. Lives were yet to be lost. And yet, simply by seeing the Lord be faithful to them and make this provision for them to defend themselves was enough to send them into greatly exultant rejoicing. And I think it gives a good example to us again to rejoice when we see the small victories. Rejoice when you still see Jesus Saves painted on the side of a building or on a billboard. Rejoice when you drive by so many Christian churches still in our ever paganizing land. Rejoice when you see a politician do something honest, if you can actually believe that they did. So many people of the land then became Jews. Our final major point tonight is that Israel was always meant to be a missionary nation. We've noted with great repetition in this study that the Jews are God's chosen people. They're the apple of his eye. Anyone who raises their hand against the Jewish people does so at their own peril and to their own ultimate demise and destruction, because they are the people whom God has chosen. He's put his name, he's put his reputation on them. He's staked his faithfulness and his character upon their survival and their ultimate success in this situation. But it wasn't just because God is some kind of a racist. God goes, well, I just like them more. I appreciate how funny they are when they do comedic movies and comedic roles. That wasn't it. God chose them with a very specific goal. Genesis 12:3, I will bless, God promising to Abraham, the Abrahamic covenant, I will bless those who bless you, and I'll curse those who curses you, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. You see, it wasn't just because of his promises, it wasn't just because of his characters, because the Jewish people are the instrument through which God will bring the Messiah. He would bring the Messiah through the Jewish people to die for sin, to be risen again, And that same Jewish Messiah will come and rule over his nation of Israel and is King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and it is the only hope for planet Earth. Isaiah 45:22 says, "Look to me and be saved, all you ends of the earth, for I am God and there is no other." What's he saying? He's saying, yes, Israel is the special people. They were chosen by plan. See, this is where people get so goofed up. They think that the Jews were chosen to some kind of spiritual salvation. But that's never it. In fact, no Jewish person was born into salvation, just like no child is born into a Christian home into spiritual salvation. They were chosen, not in any salvific sense, not in any sense of bending their will or some sort of supernatural hocus pocus going on. They were chosen to be the instrument of God's salvation on the earth. They were meant to be God's nation of priests and God's representatives who made him known from one horizon to the other. That was always God's purpose. And we say, why did he do that? Why didn't he just, use skywriting? Well, first of all, it's his choice how he chooses to do things, but it is impressive. When God wanted to make himself known on the earth, he chose a people and worked through them and revealed himself in them and tasked them with making him and his glory known throughout the world. When God wanted to save the world, he took on flesh and came down and identified as one of us and taught us and spoke and died for our sins. God is, in nature, relational. And so he teaches us through relationships, whether that is interpersonal, one-on-one relationships, group relationships, national relationships. He reveals himself to humans through human situations, through the nation of Israel. Isaiah 49:6 says, "Indeed," he says, it is too small a thing that you should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to restore the preserved ones of Israel. I will also give you as a light to the Gentiles." Wonderful phrase. You can search throughout Scripture. This picture of that Israel, that the Jews are a light to the Gentiles. They were meant to reveal the knowledge of the living God, the righteousness and character of the living God to the world. And you should be my salvation to the ends of the earth. When Jonah failed to obey God, God used his failure to bring salvation to one small group of pagan sailors before using Jonah to bring salvation to the entire pagan city of Nineveh. When Israel blew it, it proved to bring the word of God to Babylon. And Jews continued to have an important impact on the ancient world throughout the time of their various diaspora or scatterings throughout the people. Wherever they went, continued to be a faithful reminder of all of God's character and goodness. They continue to act as a light of the Gentiles, and they continue to exist even to this day because they are God's chosen earthly vessel. God's choice for service in this regard. Well, in closing tonight, I just want to point out that the darkness ends. Surely it would have been difficult to trust God throughout this situation if you'd heard your government was going to kill you on a certain day or come after you and your family on a certain day. What would you do? How would you figure it out? Would you scramble? Would you run? Would you store up? What would you do? Well, it would be difficult, certainly, to trust God in that situation. But God was in control every moment. Those who set themselves against God will ultimately be destroyed. It doesn't mean that they'll be destroyed in this lifetime. It does not mean that they will find the horrifying results in earthly punishment. But pray that they do. It is an opportunity, right, when God reveals his righteousness and his wrath upon people in these temporal moments. It gives them an opportunity to turn, to repent, to change their minds, to come to the right way of thinking. So those who destroy themselves, those who set themselves against God and his plan will ultimately have no choice but to face destruction. Some will receive justice in this life, but all in the life to come. And the most important point is the last. And that's that the more would know God by trusting Jesus Christ and be restored. You see, you could almost take this entire story and boil it down to this final point, that not only did God preserve the Jews, but more grew to know the God of Israel. In spite of the persecution that had happened and the persecution that was yet to come. Might it be so with us in the church today? Our moments of persecution, when the world is at odds with us, we have the opportunity, like the Jews were, to be different, to be separate from all the world's ridiculous whining and squabbling, and represent the interests of our true homeland, heaven, where our true citizenship is. And might we, like Esther was, keep our focus on point and keep the good news of Jesus Christ readily on our lips and not settle for any less in that which we share. Let's close our time with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you and we praise you for this wonderful book. This account of Esther, so quickly and easily read or possibly looked over. Father, it sounds so secular to the first reading. And yet, we've seen how your fingerprints are on every page. How it was you who brought Queen Esther to this point. And through her wisdom and grace and tact, were able to change the course of what would have been a major catastrophe for this world and save countless lives. We praise you and we thank you that your demonstrable sovereignty over history means that we can trust you with our lives today and our souls forevermore by the person and work of your Son, Jesus Christ, in whose name we pray. Amen.